Once again, thank you very much for being with us. We're opening this second session of this panel. In the first part, we discussed the contemporary art in the, classical, conventional spaces and the contemporary arts intervention. That part, we can, I guess, talk a little more about that. Yes, all right. Contemporary art is, by and large, taken to transferred to the classical spaces or museums holding already the classical art. But what is the role of all these interventions? We can talk more about this. But now I want to give the floor to Glenn Lowry. He is the head of Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he has transformed the museum a lot, and he's a good friend of us. And now my question to him is, MoMA is a different creature than the other museums, attached to the classical art. All right, Mademoiselle d'Avignon of Picasso might be now considered as a classical art, but we're not trying to go to that part of the discussion. And instead, I would say, what is the role of the contemporary art in a museum which collects the most important examples of the modern art, beginning by the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and what in general MoMA gained from the contemporary art in general. Glenn?
Thank you very much, and of course it's a pleasure to be here. Does that work? Thank you very much, and of course it's a pleasure to be here and to participate on this panel. I feel a little bit like the interloper because, of course, we deal primarily at the Museum of Modern Art with the contemporary, and the past is, for us, the last 50 years, not the last 500 or 1,000 years. And I'm reminded a little bit of a professor that was invited to a seminar that actually Tom Lentz and I participated in years ago at Harvard, and it was a kind of roundtable discussion, and we decided to invite a very well-known English medievalist who worked on 13th and 14th century medieval architecture, and somebody asked him during the course of this conversation what he thought about some Renaissance church, and he said, well, I don't do contemporary architecture. It's all relative. It's all relative. And what I see as sort of the critical issue when talking about either the past within the context of a contemporary institution or the present in the context of a more historical institution is the way in which conversations can be generated. Because I think the critical dimension for a museum is its ability to create a sustained, vibrant, and ongoing conversation about works of art. So in this context, contemporary art is essential because it is the way in which the voice of the living artist is introduced into that conversation. It is true, as has been said, that all historical art was contemporary at one point. But contemporary in the context of today is actually a language. It is not simply a description of art that is made at this moment. It's also a denominator of a particular kind of artistic practice that differentiates itself from artists who work in more traditional modalities. So when we think about contemporary art, we're not only talking about the art of the present, we're also talking about artists who are willing to engage with a set of ideas, issues, and practices, whether they are in Istanbul or Beijing or New York or Tokyo or Sao Paulo. And that conversation that they generate, that comes out of their work, is different in kind by the very nature of the fact that they are alive and present than our response to works of art made by artists who are no longer with us. And for me, what is essential even in an institution whose period of collecting is very compressed by the standards of the Louvre or the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Our window is a window of about 100 years. Even in that window, the ability of contemporary artists to get under your skin, as it were, by asking questions or creating objects that are problematic, that challenge the way we see and think, that alter the way we understand other works of art, becomes a central feature of staying relevant. And I do think that's an important point, at least in the context of the American Museum. It may not be so true elsewhere. But how does an institution whose responsibilities span decades and ultimately centuries remain relevant to the public at large? How do you ensure that your institution is part of a civic discourse, is a central aspect of the way in which a community thinks and believes in itself and thinks about the rest of the world? And the way you do that, I believe, is by ensuring that there's a vibrant conversation. And of course, when one's responsibilities are historical to works that were made decades and centuries ago, one has a double responsibility to be true to those works and to put them in their proper historical context, but also to find ways in which those works retain and expand on their meaning today. And when works of art no longer speak to us, then they become artifacts. They actually have a kind of ontological change in what they are. And I think the role of a museum, at least an art museum, is to ensure that it is the custodian of art, not artifacts, objects that resonate in the present. So to come back in a long-winded way to your question, at a place like the Museum of Modern Art, the contemporary has always been contentious. It has been fought over and debated. When I arrived at the museum 20 years ago, it was at the end of a period of questioning. Norman would know this well because he has many colleagues who were part of that debate. It was at the end of a querying period when the museum actually asked itself, should it continue to collect? Should it stay involved with the art of the 80s and the 90s? Because it had such a well-established and well-respected collection of late 19th and early 20th century art. In the new art that was being made seemed so antithetical and maybe even slight compared to those towering figures of Pollock and Leger and de Kooning and Matisse and Picasso. And there was actually a raucous, vicious, and at times heated debate over the need to continue. Ultimately, it was left to the new director, that happened to be me, to make that decision. It was a kind of, we'll set up a committee and we'll let the committee decide. So when I got involved with the museum, it was with a group of curators who really were committed to contemporary art, who did not want to see the museum frozen in time. But as we moved much more vigorously into contemporary, it's not that the museum wasn't about to collect contemporary art. The question is, how was it going to divide its pie? Was contemporary going to represent 10% of our activity, or was it going to represent 70% of our activity? And as we started to expand on where we wanted to be, from, let's say, a small amount to a large amount of interest, of course, it gets messy because the jury is out. One will never know whether a young artist today, whose work you think is really important, is going to be as important as an artist whose career is already established. So you have to be willing to engage that risk, to engage with that problem. But I think that problem animates what we do, in the same way that when a museum like the Metropolitan invites a living artist to do an intervention on their roof, it isn't just because they want the energy of that young artist and the audience that that young artist will bring. It's also because they want that work to throw other works of art at the museum in relief, to put a different context for seeing it. And it's a little bit, the analogy I would have is a telescope works both ways, right? You can look at it in one direction and it brings works of art, or it brings an object, or it brings some celestial body much closer to you. If you turn it around, it also puts a great distance. And I think you want works of art within the context of a museum that do both, that provide the space of reflection and distance, but that also foreground sets of problems in the immediate present. Wow, that was an elliptical way of getting it.
Very good,
something.
thank you very much. And all right, now what I'm going to do is this. Now I will give everybody 5 minutes to reflect on the other panelists' views and opinions. And can we start, Norman, with you? And I have a special question for you. And that is, you know, Glenn was talking about this double function of the museums. And in that sense, what would you say about another thing that I would like to bring into your attention? That is, you know, cities, for example. In the 19th century, still cities used the sculptures, right, as the monuments, but Rodin also had, you know, a sculpture of Balzac, and it was erected somewhere in Paris. Now, is there any difference, for example, between Paris erecting that monument by Rodin and, say, Istanbul, hopefully, you know, having a sculpture by Kapoor, for example?
If I
No.
Sorry. I mean, if I go down into the London Underground at the moment, I see these big advertisements for Chicago. Nothing to do with Anish Kapoor, of course. Huge advertisement. Come to Chicago. Chicago is trying to project itself as better than New York, if I may say so. I mean, that's the kind of deal. And right in the middle of that advertisement is Cloudgate. I mean, it's unbelievably, I mean, I went to Anish's studio. He never goes on the Underground, but I go on the Underground all the time, being an ordinary person. And, you know, I said to him, you know, everywhere in the Underground you can see Cloudgate in London. I think one of the things one has to say, I mean, you know, I think Glenn has given us huge food for thought about, you know, particularly about the state of, you know, the particular position of his particular museum, that in the end, I mean, generalizations are fantastically dangerous. That in the end, it's about the specifics. It's, as I said the other day, I think at the press conference when talking about Anish, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, when you're thinking about a work of art, whether it's by a very, very young artist or a very established artist, or indeed when you're engaged in a dialogue with Rembrandt or an Assyrian relief or whatever it is, when you're engaged in that dialogue, it's the only thing that ought to matter, and if it's good enough, it's the only thing, and that's what gives it its kind of universality. And one of the good things and the bad things about museums is that one drifts from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. You know, one of the problems of biennales, for example, is one drifts from, you know, booth to booth to booth. It's a little bit like going to an art fair in a way. I happen to think that the Istanbul Biennale, you know, partly because for all sorts of personal reasons I wasn't able to go to the Venice Biennale this year and see all the other biennales that have been taking place. I thought it was incredibly beautiful, made a very beautiful contrast with, if you like, the heaviness and the solidity of the Kapoor exhibition here. And it has a very beautiful and rather touching fragility, and yet a certain kind of narrative, which I found kind of beautiful and rather touching, and I enjoyed it very much. But what I want to say is that really it goes on a case-by-case basis. I think one of the classic cases in recent years of a dialogue of a contemporary artist. Some people would dispute whether he's a contemporary artist, but I happen to think that he is a very contemporary artist, namely Jeff Koons. When Jeff Koons was in Versailles, it was the most fantastic and wonderful dialogue. And I can tell you why I can say that. First of all, I enjoyed it very much myself. I went on an ordinary day. I didn't go to the opening and all that kind of thing. I just went because, you know, he's the kind of guy that I know and I'm interested in and so on and so forth. And the joy on the faces of the thousands of visitors who go to Versailles anyway was really one of the most wonderful pleasures as a kind of so-called professional within this world I've had in recent years, because you could really feel the incredible dialogue and the wonderful affinities which were taking place between, if you like, the kind of sophisticated vulgarity of Versailles, and if I can say so, the sophisticated vulgarity of Jeff Koons. And it was really unbelievably touching, and there was a kind of equality and a kind of sense of equilibrium, very Jeff Koonsian word, a wonderful sense of equilibrium between these two kind of events that, if you like, are separated by 300 years. And so I think what I call, you know, if the British Museum, or, for example, the Archaeological Museum, or Topkapi here in Istanbul, or any of or the Louvre, they do these things now all the time, as I was saying, because, as I said, it's actually only in this last century, if you like, in the epoch of the Museum of Modern Art, that at one kind of level, contemporary art and modern art has become a little bit estranged, even at certain times completely estranged from the generality, which was not the case, as I said earlier, in earlier epochs. I mean, you know, in ancient Egypt, people were interested in contemporary creativity or what was going on around them at the time. You know, obviously art was related to religion for a very long time and so on and so forth. But on the whole, through the centuries, right down to the end of as it were, the third or fourth quarter of the 19th century, art was basically always contemporary. Then things go out of fashion, then they come back into fashion. There was some talk about art to artifact. Art becomes an artifact, and then somehow in our present culture, things are rediscovered and they become art again. It's kind of very strange, it's very mysterious, and it's very individual. I think one has to think about the individuality of pieces. You know, when you're reading Dostoevsky, you're not reading James Joyce. If you're going to if you're going to see Hamlet, you're not looking at a Sophocles. If you're going to a Mozart opera, you're not listening to Wagner. And when you're listening or reading or engaging with any of those one things, it's as though it was the only thing that matters. And that's one of the kind of problems and the problematics of art. We are very interested in the dialogue between works of art. And we are finding, and dialogue, of course, is fantastically interesting as you look from A to B, and when you go around an exhibition, you know, it's very beautiful to see things as they're put together. And and works of art can speak together, and sometimes they can feel completely alien. And I think it has to do with the specifics and specific works of art that are able to speak to each other. If I'm allowed to say one other thing, if I can do a little bit of self-advertising, I'm doing this program of contemporary art at the Ashmolean Museum. They've never done contemporary art before.
Yes.
And they're doing it in this big well, and they've cleared out this big well called the human figure, you know, and they were kind of, so we can have contemporary art exhibitions. And I said, there's this beautiful Assyrian relief. Let's leave it there. It's a beautiful Assyrian relief. And, you know, in the context of the Ashmolean Museum, which is one of the oldest, it's small, but one of the great small universal museums of the world, and since its kind of quasi-modernization in recent years, it really has become a spectacular and beautiful place to visit. So that every artist who shows there, as long as I'm around anyway, I hope, will have this kind of a beautiful Assyrian relief to act as a kind of measure. I hope that's going to be very beautiful, and I think it will be.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Claus-Peter has a point to make. Yes, please.
Dear Norman, is it a laughter, Jeff Koons in the Topkapi Saray? Is it a laughter? Is there any difference between Jeff Koons in Versailles and in the Topkapi Saray? Could you imagine that there is a balance of whatsoever historical equivalence and contemporary balance, or is it only to be proven within Western art? Is it a dangerous question these days to consider the symbolism in the Topkapi Saray and to do away, perhaps to let Versailles with the time become sort of an artifact which one sees as a distant, uninteresting mass of gold?
I'd always rather Glenn answered that question, because obviously my answer is no. I mean, sorry. I mean, I think these affinities, as I say, have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. They're either done with style or they're not done with style. They're either appropriate or they're not appropriate. And one just has to see, you know, that's where, if you like, the so-called curator and the artist himself or herself comes into play. I mean, it's the dialogue, and the dialogue is sometimes good, sometimes the dialogue is hopeless and embarrassing. Right. Do you agree with that?
Glenn?
I actually agree with you entirely about how successful Jeff's show Intervention was in Versailles, in part because it had a brilliant curator, Laurent Lebon, who had a real understanding of both Versailles and Jeff's work, but more importantly, because Jeff's work addresses, in exactly the way you mentioned, the same kinds of issues that we now look at Versailles and admire, that kind of over-the-top vulgarity that over centuries gets seasoned into high culture, is something that Jeff consciously explores. So it's for that reason that I don't think Jeff would be an artist whose interventions at the Topkapi might work. He doesn't deal with he doesn't engage the histories in the same way that he does at a place like Versailles, which doesn't mean there aren't artists who could produce equally interesting results at a place like the Topkapi. I just wonder whether Jeff would be the right one. In fact, I doubt that he would be.
I don't disagree with that.
We're at a very important point here.
All right. Tomas?
Well, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to that. As somebody down there said, we all have our own specific set of circumstances, and I'm a little bit different than everyone up here. I sit atop an academic museum. I have multiple competing factions. As I mentioned, we're building a new museum. One of my great challenges is not to let my many constituents, chief among them Harvard University, think that we're simply building another large, expensive, static mausoleum, a kind of treasure house. So from my perspective, and I'm battling a lot of historical legacies there, contemporary art is very much a path forward for us. But given the fact that our collections, unlike, for example, Glenn's museum, the vast majority of our collections are historical in nature. I have 27 curators who are deeply invested in those traditions. So I'm dealing with massive turf wars. And as I mentioned before, for some of the reasons that Glenn very clearly articulated, the ability of a contemporary artist to retranslate older traditions, in a sense to shift our lens, is enormously important, because what we're interested in as well are these kinds of cross-cutting dialogues. They reanimate, they revivify older traditions. And for me, the challenge is getting the balance right. We want a much greater emphasis on modern and contemporary art. I have a large faction that is convinced I'm going to turn the museum into a modern and contemporary museum. That's virtually impossible for us, but in an academic institution, a lot of the old ideas, it sounds hard to believe, but a lot of old ideas die hard, especially at a place like Harvard. And those battles are fought on a daily basis. So contemporary art is something that it has to be part of our future. I struggle with curators. We have 3 or 4 modern and contemporary curators. They're generally seen as interlopers in other parts of the museum. There's a fear on the part of my curatorial staff that modern and contemporary is taking over the museum. So one of my challenges is, how do I get people to understand that contemporary art and contemporary artists represent a different language? They do different things with historical materials, and that it shouldn't be feared. I don't think we, as a number of people have said, you want to be strategic, what you do, you want to be meaningful and balanced, but those are the sorts of dynamics I have to deal with.
All right, thank you. Deepak, do you have a point to make regarding all this huge food for thought?
No, I want to go back to what Glenn said earlier on about how contemporary art is a way of sort of reinvigorating a collection, and how a contemporary gaze, in fact, obviously changes for a different perspective on what one sees or has known, even in the recent past, or collections, I mean, works which are not very old. And I think that whole idea about infusing a new form of vitality, whatever the nature of the work, is perhaps one way of sort of breaking with, let's just say, the kind of pessimism one associates with someone like Adorno when he talks about museum and mausoleum being, more than phonetically linked, when he calls museums as the family sepulchres of art. So I think in that sense, but obviously it all depends on the context and the circumstance and how a particular work or a particular artist deals with a particular collection or a museum. I'm not sure, of course, as Norman said about how initially modern art was met with had a sort of estranging effect on the public. I'm not sure being estranged by a work of art is such a bad thing. And the estrangement is part of, it's sort of going, it's sort of distancing oneself or feeling distanced by what one sees and not really understanding or being bewildered by what one sees, but also eventually a way of going back to it differently, which is why I'm sure Jeff Koons at Versailles was a huge crowd puller, but I'm not sure that is really I mean, I think it worked in Versailles, and I'm glad you described him as kitsch.
What about the Taj Mahal?
He didn't say kitsch, he said sophisticated vulgarity, which is a better way of putting
Sure,
that.
okay, which I mean, kitsch is not very far from that.
Yeah.
That's
a very diplomatic way of putting it.
But so yeah, again, of course, I agree. It's all a question of one can't generalize, obviously.
All right.
I mean, for example, to go back to Versailles, I thought it was very amusing. I don't know whether Jeff Koons thought about it or Laurent Le Bon, but to put in this huge room 3 sort of hoovers, I think was very witty. So I agree.
All right, Martin.
I mean, I think
Could you please push the button? All right.
very brief, because I think
Get a little bit closer.
more or less everything is already said, and it would be much better if we open it to the public. A very short comment, because at least it was always important for me. I think that the whole, I mean, it's not a movement, but the interest in culture, in questions of civilizations, changed our world pretty much during the last 30, 40 years. I remember when I started to work in the museums field, my friends just thought I'm old-fashioned. I mean, this kind of dusty place, and today we are here in a beautiful museum, and there's the Biennale, and it changed Istanbul, and this impact on the society, of change of societies. That's something that's a combination of museums, the art world, and it's an interesting culture in general. And I think that's really something we can appreciate, and the V&A definitely was part of that. It's part of that development when in the mid-19th century they started to understand the museum as a space for a different part of the society than it used to be before. But it's part of the DNA, and I think it happens probably in a lot of other museums today. The problem in the DNA of the V&A was that they started at this public forum, And then 20 years later, they, with a lot of money, they traveled the world and collected a beautiful, an amazing collection, sorry. I'm sure you know the collection of the V&A. So it's always this tension between the history and the collection of the V&A and the brilliant new ideas coming in. And I think that's something that happened in the last 10, 20, 15 years in a lot of other museums around the planet. But it's a very positive tension because it is somehow combined with the development in our society, a different openness. We talked about that while we had dinner. Think about Istanbul and the contemporary art world or the art world 20 years ago. It's completely different. It was another city. And I think that's something we really have to appreciate.
Thank you. Monsieur Jarrige.
I just wanted to point out the fact that in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, all the museums were built according to the same model. Greek temples, you have them everywhere, in which you would fit the collection. So the collection had to adjust to something which was an architecture which was supposed to refer to what had been the golden age of the humanities, that means the classical period. A big change has occurred, of course, in the last 50 years. Now, even if you have a museum of prehistorical art or medieval art, the new building will be built by a great architect. It can be Pei, Yeri, I don't know. And so now you see this collection are set within a completely contemporary architecture. So you have, again, here a new dialogue between the contemporary architecture and the collection. And it's quite interesting when you are reshaping a museum with a modern architect. Some of the art pieces which were displayed before, in this new setting, you feel that there are more documents than masterpieces. And you have the temptation, and a good temptation, to put them in the study galleries and to make a selection which is stimulated by this dialogue between a modern architecture and a collection, ancient collection. And also, as you know, there's a rule in France, 1% of the construction work should be devoted to contemporary art. You have to fit some contemporary art within the new architecture. So I think this dialogue, as we are talking of dialogue, between modern architecture and classical collection is something which is, has been a great change in the display of the collection.
Thank you. Professor Claus-Peter, you have one more point? There was a question, so if you have some other points, I can take them as well.
No, I think Lowry should comment on that.
Go ahead. No? Okay. All right. I think we've completed this round as well, regarding all these reflections. Can we now open the floor for further discussion? Do you have any questions, comments, any contributions? Feel free. Yes, please. Shall we give them a mic? Mikrofon var mı? Verecek miyiz? Evet. Yeah.
My question will be to Sir Rosenthal, if he may. You have been under the roof of Royal Academy for many years. Like, if I'm not wrong, you started your career with Robert Motherwell's exhibition, and like, it has been many years since you are fighting against the bureaucracy and all the boundaries.
Can you say that again?
Well, since many years you opened and organized many exhibitions and fight against the bureaucracy and the boundaries. I know about the dramas and so on. Anyway, my point is like the academy has always been like, my question is gonna be very layered, so I have to say beware. The academy has always been the peak of the English modern art, in my opinion, especially after the early one morning, if I have to say a name, the Sir Antonio Caro, and after that the English sculpture has transformed to something else, and like today we are seeing Hearst, Kapoor, and so on. English sculptures are always setting the standards anyway, and the academy always sets at the peak of that. And like now, you left your post, and also your colleague Mary Ann Stevens has also left her post as well. And like now you're working independent, and like how is the feeling of being independent without all the boundaries, comparing to being dependent to the
All I can say, I mean,
bureaucracy.
it's not about, sorry, I don't want to talk about myself. But I mean, you know, basically, you know, it was incredible privilege to serve and work in an incredible, potentially, and as it turned out, in fact, wonderful institution with a great history, which had been unbelievably conservative. And by having been unbelievably conservative, as it were, the radical became just that little bit more shocking. So by being shocking, it drew attention to itself. So when one did occasionally do radical things, you know, attention was drawn to it, and that was kind of beautiful. And, you know, I had an extraordinary time. Now I'm a freelance person and basically retired, but I do the odd little job here and there.
What are the pros and cons? That was
the pros and cons are, it's like all things. I mean, as I like to say, I'll be rather rude about that. You're either a slave to an institution, and of course it was a great privilege. I was in a very privileged slave position. And now, if you like, one is a whore to the wonderful world of art, but also a very privileged whore. So I'm not complaining. I've had a fantastic life, and that's not the point. I don't think that's the point of this discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, you got the... All right.
Thank you very much, sir.
Glenn Lowry is going to leave at 5 o'clock, so if you have some questions for him, let's take them first. Güler Hanım, yes, please.
First of all, on behalf of Sabancı Museum, I'm grateful to all of you for being here and sharing your interesting thoughts. I have questions to all of the floor, but specifically, Jarrige has said about contemporary architecture together with the traditional or the classical works. Martin has talked about VA's beginnings of interested seriously buying collections from all around the world. There's now a moment, can we call it a movement? I don't know even that, but something is happening in Abu Dhabi. I want your comments on that. Would it be, you know, they are buying like they bought in Victoria and Albert's collection. They are bringing interesting and very dominant modern architecture or contemporary architecture there. They're bringing classical art, and would it be enough? Is that what it makes a change in the art world?
Who's going to pick this question up? Glenn? Because Norman told me that I should direct the question to you.
Merci pour tout. No, you know, look, one of the I've been thinking a lot about this because there's a very heated debate in the United States around the Detroit Museum of Art, because Detroit's gone bankrupt, one of the first really large city in the United States to go bankrupt, and there is the very remote possibility that as part of the bankruptcy, the Detroit Museum would be forced to sell works of art to help lower Detroit's debt. And everybody's shocked. How could you do this? And I remember reading something in the New York Times this morning about, well, you know, the people who are going to buy this art, if it's sold, are the Russians and the Chinese and the French. All these billionaires are going to buy all this art. Well, where did the art come from? When America had all that money, it bought the art from the Russians and the French and the Chinese who had to sell it. And you know, art moves. There's nothing that says a work. I don't remember any one of Moses' tablets that said A work of art shall never leave a museum. All museums shall always be permanent. These things happen. It's part of a world that's changing. So what's taking place, not just in Abu Dhabi, because there are other regions in the Gulf and elsewhere that are in the midst of constructing, developing their cultural infrastructure because they have the wealth and the ambition to do so. And it stands to reason that they're going to acquire the great works of art they want from the places that have them. And thus, we will see whether or not over time there's enough wealth and enough great art to enable a place like Abu Dhabi to build a kind of cultural infrastructure that will change civil society there. That's a question that's on the table. And you can be very cynical about what's taking place in Abu Dhabi and look at it as a kind of very sophisticated real estate move to make Abu Dhabi a cultural place for regional tourism, or you can actually look at it as a very serious effort to build a new society. But whichever way you look at it, I think what we're really seeing in China, in the Middle East, in Russia in part, is a shift in where the wealth and the power resides. And with that shift, a desire to have the accoutrements that come with great wealth and the ambition to be sophisticated.
I just wanted to add to what...
right bench, wing, flank, all right, Anas?
I just wanted to quickly add to what Glenn said. I think what happens in the Persian Gulf is a particular mystery to Americans because Americans, in their own typical way, think it's all about them. But clearly, the model that is being constructed in the Persian Gulf doesn't in many ways include America. As Glenn said, in many ways it's about regional tourism, and it's about linking East Asia and South Asia and the Middle East with Europe. So I couldn't agree more with what you said, and in fact, Glenn and I at different times used to work for the Freer Gallery of Art, which has extraordinary collections of Chinese and Japanese art. Well, where did Charles Lang Freer acquire all of that? During very difficult political and economic times in China and Japan. So it's just a continuation of the cycle, and as Martin mentioned earlier, and it's been surprisingly absent from this discussion, but the whole issue of the market and the fact that, well, in this case, contemporary art, for many collectors of contemporary art, it is a commodity more than anything else. It's a fungible asset.
Thank you. Monsieur Jarrige.
I just wanted to say that I agree with what Glenn Lowry said. I'm a member of the purchasing committee of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and we have had a lot of discussion about the purchases. The catalog has been, what has been done has been recently published, and I can assure you that what has been collected is of quality, and it's extremely interesting to see the people from Abu Dhabi with very willing to have a sort of universal museum with Chinese art, Japanese art, Indian art. Even you see 18th century painting with naked lady. We thought that it could not. No, they say, okay, we won't have. And I think it's like in the 19th century when all major cities, Berlin, London, Paris, were in competition to have universal museum, you see, from antiquity to modern period. And I think it's good that museums in the Arabic world are not devoting all their attention to calligraphy and to Islamic art, is either Shia or Sunni, I don't know, but it's a great opening, and I think politically it's a very important gesture.
All right, Norman. Sorry, yeah, Glenn.
Very quickly,
Could you push the button, please? Yeah.
I apologize, but I very quickly remembered an anecdote that to me describes the situation. And the anecdote has to do with the great dealer, Joseph Duveen, who was the purveyor of some of the most important European art great Renaissance paintings to American and in some instances European museums. But it was said about Duveen that he had only one great idea in his entire life, and that was that Europe had a lot of art and America had a lot of money. And ever it was thus.
All right. Norman, please.
Yeah, but I agree with everything that Glenn said, and when these remarks that he's made today get into the art newspaper, there'll be a hell of a lot of, it'll be kind of difficult for him. But be that as it may, I think what museums now need to develop, if I may say so, given the world as it is today, and the world today is not just the Western world. We need to develop in museums, or there is needed to be developed in the world today, and particularly amongst the Western museums, that's to say, the museums of Europe and the museums of North America, a much greater sense of sharing. And I think on getting away from the idea of possession, because possession, that the Mona Lisa happens to be in the Louvre, that the Demoiselles d'Avignon happens to be, for reasons of history, in the Museum of Modern Art, is in a sense one of those kind of crazy accidents of history. And we need, in all sorts of different ways, I'm not saying that the Demoiselles d'Avignon should suddenly spend the next 5 years in Abu Dhabi particularly, but what I'm saying is that if museums can get, even beyond the importance of exhibitions, temporary loan exhibitions, such as we see here at the Sabancı Museum, if museums can somehow get more universal all over, through concepts of sharing, I think this would be incredibly helpful and incredibly important, and I think, funnily enough, will be, through pressure, the way forward. And I think it's not just about returning patrimony, it's not about things from Anatolia having to be here. I think it's much more useful for great Western art, or great work from China, or great work from all over the world to be here, and so people can share in the universalist idea everywhere in the world. I think that would be very, very healthy, and to find a way forward, and for museums to work through the wonderful Bizot group, for example, which I used to be part of. We discussed these kind of issues when I was a member of that group to some degree. I think would be very, very healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? You have a point? Yes, please. Use this.
Well, the market is somehow twofold. One part of the market, of course, has to support artists as well as collectors, and as well as the dealer. The other part, of course, has to support this international activity of major exhibitions. This is, I think, what you mentioned, one of the possibilities of really bringing the interest internationally around the world. I don't think that the Louvre Abu Dhabi will be a very great success for the Arab world. It will surely be a great success for East Asian and maybe some part of the southern hemisphere. But the change within the Arab world, I think, will be mainly a market value change. That is such a complex of problems when you consider the travel of a work of art from here to there and so on. So many conditions must be ready that an object of art is sold to an institution. You should be sure that it is well kept there, and you should be sure that the conditions of its presentation to a general public are secured. This is not quite the case. I must contradict here. Do read a little bit of the Arabic commentaries on the Museum Islands in Abu Dhabi. They copied the name from Berlin. We should have taken a little fee for that. But the idea is that this may be somehow attacked by certain circles within these states. On the other hand, we need to share the objects. And the problem of possession, this is a juridical problem, and there are other specialists who can deal with it. But we need to share the objects. We just need to be sure that they are under best conditions. the examples are vast where this goes wrong. And we had a terrible disaster with a loan to Egypt, the first one ever from Berlin. But it was very hard to survive that.
All right, thank you. Norman has just one sentence.
Just to say that, in a funny kind of way, the market, which somehow has been vaguely attacked, attacked by one or two people on this platform, is actually one of the great mechanisms for the preservation and genuine value of, objects that we describe as art. All those kind of value, those things that we find precious and are important. And the value system in the world that we happen to live in is very much, the art market plays a very, very significant role in that.
Then I have a very
both for modern and old things.
All right, I have a very, very provocative question. Would Lowry, for example, ever sell Mona Lisa?
There's a committee day after tomorrow, yes, I think planning the situation with maybe to Germany, because I think the situation is much better in Germany. We don't want Mona Lisa to go too far, so...
Everything has a price.
All right.
You cannot sell Mona Lisa, it was offered to the king, François I, so you cannot sell gifts. Which is, by the way, true. It's a great question. Can we sell gifts for Detroit Museum or other places?
Could you push the button, please?
No, we say it's difficult to sell gifts, and the discussion is going on with the Detroit Museum too. So Mona Lisa was given to the king.
Right.
The family of the king is still alive, so we don't think they'll agree.
Yes, Bülent.
But you do have a history in France of terminating kings.
Yeah, all right, definitely. You kill the kings, but keep the gifts. That's a better way of putting it. They kill the kings and keep the gifts. That's yeah, exactly. All right. Any contribution from this wing? All right. One more question, please. Yes, please. Yeah, here's the mic.
Teşekkürler mikrofon için. Benim sorum müzeler ve performans sanatı ile ilgili. Özellikle 60'larda ortaya çıkan happeninglerle başlayan bir olay var. Bunlarda herhangi bir kayıt ya da herhangi bir belgeleme durumu yok. Ama genel olarak baktığımızda müzeler bir arşiv oluşturmaya çalışıyor. Bir nevi aslında bir bireyden yola çıkıp bir insanlık tarihi oluşturuyorlar. Ama baktığımda mesela klasik müzelerde çok fazla performans sanatına yer verildiğini göremiyorum. Siz bu konuda ne düşünüyorsunuz? Yani performans sanatının dönüşümü ne yönde olabilir?
Kime sordunuz bu soruyu?
Yani aslında Claus-Peter'a soruyorum, merak ediyorum.
Peki.
Çünkü kendisi klasik bir müzeden.
Tamam.
Bir de yani genel olarak herkes cevap verirse de mutlu olabilirim. Teşekkürler.
Ben de olurdum herkes cevap verse memnun.
Fark etmez.
Buyurun. Yeah.
Just very briefly, the Museum of Islamic Art has not done performances until very recently. I think in 2005 we had a Iranian theater for 20 people of audience. There was not more room for that. But this has been filmed. Some of the museums do have archives with documentation of happenings in the early 20s even. But until now this has not been well researched. You know, some of the best archaeological excavations can be done in the archives of museums, and you are welcome to do that.
Glenn is about to leave, so before that he has, I think, a point to make about this question.
I just wanted to say that the resurgence of performance, which doesn't just date back to the 1960s, it dates back to the 1920s and 30s with Dada and with other artistic movements, is something that I find absolutely fascinating and extremely important. And the challenge with all performance art is finding a way to both enable it to occur and to appropriately document it so that there is a rich archival background.
Thank you very much.
And I apologize
Yes,
for having
no,
to.
please, please. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. All right. Very good to have you here. All right. Martin, you have a point to make?
No. The
Yeah,
V&A has the National Archive for Theatre and Performance, which is an amazing, amazing source for exhibitions in general, but for research and, I mean, a lot more. The Bowie exhibition that we mentioned couldn't have happened without that department or museum for theatre and performance. So if there's a recommendation for other museums, start to collect as soon as you can, because it's really not only part of a national treasure, it's the combination of art and performance, of theatre and music. And I mean, it's still not in public, but we work with the Royal Opera House on an exhibition of the history of operas that will be probably on display 2017 or 18. It's a major, major, major enterprise. With this collection, I mean, the only reason why we can do it is because we have that collection. I think that's one part of it. The other part of that answer is what really helps is the internet, the web, YouTube, and a lot of others. The possibilities that we have right now to make research all around the globe and to put documentations and documentaries into the net. So that helps as well. But collecting theatre and performance is something that was completely underrated for the last decades.
Thank you. Let's get one more question. You will, yes.
We haven't talked about technology between the transition from traditional art to contemporary art, especially in light of 20th century. For example, photography has made a great impact on the art world. Transition from Impressionism to everything that came afterwards in the 20th century. You mentioned Dada, Fauvism, etc., etc. So what do you think the new technologies are affecting contemporary art vis-a-vis from today's perspective in the 21st century?
Who are you asking the question?
Initially I was thinking Mr. Lowry, but at this point, who would like to answer the question? It will be welcome for me.
What is the question, sorry? About
I'll just say something. One of the things that I think museums with historical collections and museums that are deeply imbued with old methodologies and traditional ways of looking is a kind of fear of technology and that it will detract and pull people away from the object. I think everyone here who's worked in a museum or working in a museum today deals with that issue, that somehow technology will subsume the object, will push it into the background. And at a museum like the Harvard Art Museums that has a kind of historical legacy of close, sustained observation and reflection, it's a kind of hallmark methodology of the institution. As I mentioned, we're building a new museum and technology will be a big part of that museum. We don't see it as a threat. We see it as a complement, as a facilitator, but we never think it can actually replace the object. I mean, for example, we work very closely with a very strong art history department at Harvard, and we have a strong photography collection, and our faculty member, who is a historian of photography, he said one of the most important moments for his students is when they actually sit down in front of the photograph, the actual object, for the first time. And it's transformative for all these bright, young, ambitious students, many of who know a great deal about photography, but they know about photography from other images of photography. So again, it's a kind of constant theme today. I think the balance has to be there, but given the fact that we operate within a university environment, all the students, they're driven by technology. Harvard, about 8 or 9 years ago, spent about $100 million renovating the main library. I'm not sure how many people actually go into that library anymore and actually pull books off the shelves. So the whole nature of pedagogy, whether we're talking about art historical pedagogy or any other form of teaching, it's undergoing a transformation now. And for example, faculty and curators at Harvard are constantly questioning how they will present material, how they will teach with materials. And so it's an exciting time, but it's also an unsettling time. It's full of flux.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
I mean, I really like your question, and I don't have an answer, but I like your question. And I think there's a kind of contradiction in itself, because I think the technology and the whole engineering topic is more important than ever, and more sexy and sophisticated and cool and everything. And it's not there, and we don't talk about it, and it's not reflected in the arts, and it's the opportunities that we have. I mean, just the way, I don't want to promote an iPhone, and everyone knows about the iPhone, the problems that they have, but the technology inside, outside, the way they change the chain of production and so on, is a lot of aesthetics. And I thought, coming to the V&A, that is somehow related to that field, to that topic, that engineering is the new design, or the next topic. But if you talk about that in public, it's just, it's not, engineering or technology has not this exciting public appearance that we obviously need. But I think it's a great question, but there's no answer.
There's a huge difference, isn't there, between looking at an original photograph by, I don't know, Julia Margaret Cameron, or a 19th century photograph, an original 19th century photograph, and then kind of the engagement with the whole world of Photoshop on the one hand, and then the world of the internet and the huge amount of imagery that's circulating there. I mean, and again, once again, you can't generalize. It's all about the particular in the end, and the particular is what is beautiful about the world. It's about what particular is beautiful about human beings, and it's also the particular which is beautiful about this funny thing that we elusively call culture.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Sakıp Sabancı Museum for bringing together such an illustrious panel. In my lifetime, it would have been impossible to see all of you together, and I thank you for being here and for the interesting contributions you've made. To go back to the first theme of how the old and the new connects, we all know who the classical artists are, the traditional artists, but the contemporary ones are constantly in the making and they emerge. And I, as a layperson, I actually have no connection to art in my professional life, except I'm a consumer of art. Who decides, who are the decision makers? It's always fascinated me. Who decides who is a valid, talented contemporary artist? And have you, in your careers, actually been confronted with the issue of recognizing from scratch a talented contemporary artist, and what is the steps that you go through? And because by the time the artists come to our doorstep, all these decisions have already been taken. And the Turkish market, for instance, is flooded with all sorts of talents, and sometimes I get confused as to what is recognizable talent and what is more obscure talent. So I just wondered who makes that decision. Thank you.
Who should answer this question?
I actually don't know. I think everybody would have their own personal contribution, so whoever would like to. Thank you.
Norman, how about you? As a freelance curator.
It's not so much that I'm a freelance curator, but I've been quite involved with, what is horribly called the cutting edge. And I think it has to do basically with a kind of dialogue and an engagement. And I spend all my life, for better or worse, it's kind of one of the principal thing in my so-called professional life. And of course, anybody can get involved, and we talk about elites, but anybody's free to join that elite, and anybody's free to kind of engage in that dialogue. And that dialogue is made by, first of all, by other artists. You know, one gets information from other artists. I have to say the market plays a very big part in this, and you know, not necessarily, as some people will pretend to you, some people even on this panel might even suggest it, in a negative way. You know, the market is both good and the market is both bad. It has its good sides and its bad sides, and you know, the museums have their good sides and their bad sides too. I mean, there are lots of bad, you know, there's a lot of sins are committed in the name of art, but what are the things that rise to the surface is, you know, it's a kind of strange consensus. It's about a kind of consensus that happens over time in a slightly chaotic way, but that chaos is a beautiful way. That's a kind of beautiful chaos through which things rise and they become more or less settled. I'm not sure, you know, I mean, I think there's a good chance that Anish Kapoor, for example, who happens to be the artist here at the moment, will survive, but one can't be 100% sure, and he is not sure whether he's going to, inverted commas, survive. But I think there is a very good chance that he will, myself. But I mean, let's see, and then he may kind of, you know, disappear for a bit, and then he may resurface in the way that, for example, Victorian art in England, you know, I mean, was unbelievably valuable at the end of the 19th century, and then, you know, in the 20th century, right down to the 1960s and 70s. I remember the famous Andrew Lloyd Webber, who was not exactly my favourite musician, but is an amazing collector of Victorian art. When he was a boy, he was crazy about Victorian art, and he had the opportunity. He had an opportunity as a boy. He saw this famous painting called Flaming June by Lord Leighton, which was then later bought, you know, by some, you know, it's worth now, I don't know how many countless millions of pounds. And he said it was on sale in some shop down, he was still a schoolboy actually, it was on sale in a shop in the King's Road in London for about, I don't know whether it was £50 or £500, but I mean for a tiny amount of money, and he asked his aunt to go and buy it for him, and the aunt wouldn't buy it for him. And so he lost the opportunity to possess one of the icons, you know, of Victorian art, which, were it to come on the market today, would probably go for, I don't know, 20, 30 million pounds or maybe more. It now happens to be in a museum in Puerto Rico.
Deepak?
If I understood your question, it was about how one goes about this huge mass of artists. I think it's a question of sensibility and being immersed in the art world and choosing, and you know, especially if it comes to younger artists who, you know, so there's no rule as such, except of course to keep educating one's eye.
Testing.
But yes, certainly. But I'm not quite sure what Norman means, what money has to do about this. I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say that, when you bring in again the thing about money, or the market, sorry.
Market.
Yeah. I mean, if one is an independent curator, I'm not sure one is actually thinking about an artist's market value when one...
Some of the greatest decisions about modern art, and the most important decisions about modern art, have been made by a handful, through the ages, of great, inverted commas, dealers.
Yes.
Since, there's no question about that. That can be easily proved. Many more than have been made by museum people. Would anybody disagree with that?
No, absolutely. No, thank you. It's exactly what I mean. I mean, working in that field for the last 25 years, being a museums director for 25 years, you can imagine, well, I don't want to talk too much about that experience, but how private collectors and dealers try to bring artists in the museum just to upgrade the value. I mean, a lot of artists are just made by the market, definitely.
But I also think it's there's a kind of stereotype notion that a certain individual or can actually sort of be a kingmaker and sort of elevate an artist. I think the reality is it's a web of factors. Yeah. It's critics, it's scholars, it's galleries, it's dealers, it's the marketplace, it's museums, and ultimately I think the great decider is time itself. Time eventually sorts everything out.
Klaus-Peter?
May I add a little point? This is not the global point, but we are here in Istanbul. And of course there's the springing up Biennale. There's a new center for the arts. There's also a new market since recently, and I would somehow support the idea that apart from a general or what one calls global notion of the arts, there should be some, let us say, regional little additions to this global market. And there should be the chance for artists working in special regions of the world, in Germany, for example, or in Turkey, to have an auditory, a public of themselves, and to prove their chances first in the region. Now, this is a very complicated subject. I don't want to bring up a new issue into the discussion, but I just want to make a point for this. Only from these different regions, China and South America are now here, well represented in the Biennale I saw. This will be a very interesting experiment, how their reception will be after that, and whether this chance is continuing to the global market as well. There's a hope for that, and as we know from the Documenta examples, some of the artists from regions, not globalized regions in the world, have had a success, being for the first time made known through Documentas. Others fell from the podium again.
All right.
Off the radar.
Off the radar. Just 1 second, please. Yeah, Aisha. I'll give the floor to you. All right, Aisha. No, here, yeah. All right, you have just 1 point to make. Yeah, that's why Aisha.
Continuing the previous discussion, how do you decide, or who decides? Not how they decide. I think the question was who decides, but I think they go together. Can you distinguish between the stance of a political or ethical stance of an artist and the artwork? I mean, is there a relation? Like, can someone be a racist and a great artist at the same time? Because there are cases like that. Like Rodin, for instance, was an anti-Dreyfusard, or perhaps a better case would be Dali. I think it was George Orwell who referred to Dali, I think, as a disgusting human being. So, I mean, does that matter, or should it matter?
No.
Is there a relationship between the two? Or can you just say, well, he was as Orwell put, a disgusting human being, but a great draftsman at the same time? I mean, today, is this doable today?
Let's get away. I just want, please, everybody on this round to get away from the general. We have to go to the particular. And each individual, whether it's Rodin or whether it's Anselm Kiefer, it's a case by itself. And you just have to kind of look at it and then come to your own personal kind of judgment about it, both in terms of morality and aesthetic kind of aura, and all the other issues that run around this beautiful thing we call art that we can't quite grasp. We know what it is, we know how to recognize it, we need to put it into our contemporary art museums and into our classical museums and have interesting kinds of dialogue. But as I say, there are no rules. Get away from the idea of rules and think about the particular. Based on your experience. And everybody has a different experience, but there is something called a consensus. And this consensus is something that happens, and it's also a moving feast. And that moving feast is part of the beauty of it all. And what is said, I'm not certain in 100 years' time that everybody will want to listen to Beethoven. I think they probably will, but who can say? We can only talk about the now.
Right, thank you. Anybody else? No? Yes.
I have a question for you.
Take the mic, please.
Okay. In your country, bande dessinée, comics, for the Anglo-Saxon world, is accepted highly as a high art form?
Sorry?
Comics.
By some people. Yeah? By some people.
I said in France.
Oh, I see, in France. Oh.
Yes. And I was asking to Mr. Jarrige, it's accepted in his country la bande dessinée as a high art, and Möbius had a exhibition in Fondation Cartier. It's a highly debatable form of art. What do you think about that value judgment of art on bande dessinée? Enki Bilal, etc.
It's difficult for me to answer because I should read serious books at night, and I spend a lot of time collecting bande dessinées. This is one of my favorite, not only French one, but also the Japanese. You see, it's a fabulous draftsman. It's for me, you see, I like it, so I hope that other people in France like it, and I'm very happy, in fact, that Fondation Cartier and all these institutions are giving an important place to bande dessinée. For me, it's something I like so much. So I cannot judge because I like it. So
I can answer that.
You could propose an exhibition to the Sabancı Museum. Lascaux to Tintin.
I can answer that.
Yes, of course. Yes, yes. Deepak has an...
What? No, I think it's more a question not bande dessinée or comics, as you say, but what an artist does with that language. It's like saying, one doesn't say one likes photography, one means particular photographer, so what a photographer does. So bande dessinée is rather generic, so if you mean, for example, how Liechtenstein transforms that language, of course, yes. It is a potential, it's a language potentially for making things with it, yeah. But doesn't exclude one's enjoyment of comics, of course.
I said I would close the session at 6 o'clock, but we decided to finish it by 5:30. So if you have one last question, I can take it. No, otherwise, thank you very much for being for us. It was an honor for me to conduct this panel, and thank you all.
I have one remark to make as well.
Yes.
I can say one remark.
All right.
Ben bir seramik sanatçısıyım, aynı zamanda akademisyenim. Burada fotoğraftan, heykelden, resimden, performans sanatından bahsediyoruz ama seramik sanatıyla ilgili ne düşündüklerini merak ediyorum. Vaktimiz kısıtlı olduğu için Martin Roth'tan rica edeceğim. Çünkü Victoria Albert Müzesi'nin ciddi bir porselen koleksiyonu var ve çağdaş seramik sanatında da bir seramik patlaması yaşanıyor. Olan seramik ürünler üzerinden yeni şeyler yapmak gibi. Böyle klasik bir müzede çağdaş seramik sanatının yer alması konusunda ne düşünür acaba? Yeni değerlerin verilmesi konusunda.
That's a rather difficult question at the end of a session that is more or less over, and it's another topic for another conference, and probably it wouldn't be too bad to have a conference of that topic, because I think there are quite a few new ideas and just a different way to look at it. I mean, the V&A has a very particular way to show the ceramics. I worked for a porcelain collection before the Meissen collection in Dresden, had a completely different approach, while the V&A has a mix between storage and exhibition. But I mean, if you look at artists like, contemporary artists like Edmond de Waal, who has a beautiful display in the V&A, now an exhibition in New York, Argosian, there is something new coming, whatever it is. But it's a combination of tradition, ceramics. Most of those artists are extremely knowledgeable, knows the material, know the history. Some of them are art historians. So, I mean, it's not honestly, don't expect a real answer, but there is, I think it's worth to look at it. But it was not that exciting during the last 2 decades, but it's about to be changed.
Yes, of course.
Well, you have to think of Japan. I believe in market prices. When you see the cost of the ceramics, the great master of ceramics, living artists in Japan, they fetch fabulous prices. They are considered as top artists in Japan. So you have areas where ceramists are maybe less recognized, but you have other areas like Japan where ceramists today are still creating, you see, highly creative and fetching more value sometimes than the paintings, contemporary paintings in Japan. So this is occurring also in Korea. So from the East, the ceramic art is extremely dynamic.
Right.
Small point, I mean, relevant to this particular subject of this afternoon is whether one, for example, could do some kind of exhibition that, as it were, took masterpieces of Islamic and specifically Ottoman ceramics and somehow confronted them with some kind of contemporary ceramics, either from this region or internationally. You know, then you would see whether there is a dialogue. I don't know whether that's a subject, but it could be. And that's really the point. You know, it's about exploration and thinking and finding affinities and doing things which are genuinely beautiful and genuinely new and provide revelation.
Deepak?
I'm not nothing to do with your question, but it occurred to me that since this discussion today was, the initial topic, of course, was contemporary art in museums. And I think in Anish's talk yesterday, there was one image which was particularly eloquent of the kind of connection that can be made. It's precisely the work which he did at the Louvre, which is this sort of reflecting mirror, which is slightly distorted, and that whole idea of anamorphosis, of something which is sort of, you know, where there's slight distortion and the kind of sort of bewilderment and also wonder. I think that's one kind of metaphor, I think, of the kind of sort of connection between contemporary art and a museum like the Louvre. So.
With this remark, we're closing this session. Thank you all for being with us today, and thank you for again being with us all afternoon. And I hope we will see you again in another event organized by Sabancı Museum. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.